Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Safety by Numbers, Making Sense of Dietary Supplement Adverse Event Data with Dr. Rick Kingston. This webinar is brought to you by the Council for Responsible Nutrition, and they are the leading trade association for the dietary supplement and functional food industry. Dr. Kingston is an expert on clinical toxicology and pharmacology, poison control, product post-market surveillance, and drug and dietary supplement safety. Dr. Kingston will share information about adverse event reporting systems and the important role they play in supporting consumer safety. He will present for about 45 minutes, and we will leave some time for a brief question and answer session. You may submit your questions throughout the presentation on your GoToWebinar control panel. A PDF of Dr. Kingston's slides, as well as a link to the webinar recording, will be sent to all attendees in a follow-up email. So at this time, I would like to welcome, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Rick Kingston.
Well, thank you very much, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with colleagues around the country and talk about this important area. Just a little bit of backdrop in terms of my background and so forth. I thought what I would share as I'm trying to get my slides moving here. It's like we're having a little problem with the advancing here. There we go. Just in terms of my background, as I think was indicated in the intro, I'm with Safety Call International, which is a triple licensed healthcare practice. And we're actually licensed by the boards of medicine, veterinary medicine, and pharmacy, which is one of the only practice sites, I think, in the country that has all three practitioners in the same practice. I'm also academically affiliated with the University of Minnesota, as is our practice site. And what our core practice areas involve is primarily clinical toxicology, product safety, and regulatory reporting support for corporate entities, which includes doing post-market medical surveillance for some of the largest dietary supplement and other types of consumer product companies in the U.S. One other aspect that I come to this presentation with is that I'm also a course director for the Therapeutics of Herbs and Other Natural Medicinals at the University of Minnesota. And so I wanted to put a little bit of context around information, as you see, that comes across not only the medical literature, but also the media and how they play with information that they gleaned from the medical literature as it relates to dietary supplements and safety. I've certainly seen an article a couple of days ago in the Wall Street Journal about potential interactions. There was a fairly big article in New England Journal of Medicine a few months back taking a look at hospitalizations associated with dietary supplements, and I wanted to put some of that information in perspective. Certainly, either you have questions or your patients are going to have questions or other colleagues, and so that was kind of the impetus for doing this. As we take a look at, try to get to the next slide here. When I first started teaching our natural medicine course, like most of us, I went to the medical literature to try and find information about the safety of various herbs or other natural products. And this article caught my eye. It was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in 2002, entitled Benefits, Adverse Effects, and Drug Interactions of Herbal Therapies with Cardiovascular Effects. And certainly coming from a mainstream pharmacy and medicine background, obviously looking at an article from the Journal of American College of Cardiology, certainly I consider to be a credible source. But as I started to take a look at the information in the article, it made me take a much closer look, because one of the things that they highlighted, and you've probably heard this over the years, is important cardiovascular drug interactions that you can see at the top here. And then they listed warfarin, and they listed some of the usual suspects, including garlic, ginkgo, and ginseng. But what I found interesting is as I went over and looked at some of the supporting data, it says rare reports of elevation in INR in a subject previously stable on warfarin. Then they had, under ginkgo and ginseng, case report of CNS hemorrhage in a patient previously stable on warfarin, no other supporting data. And the same thing under ginseng, case report, not reports as with an S, but single case report, basically identifying this as a significant issue. So I went back and took a look at the original article that presented this information. It actually was an article published by a colleague and friend of mine, and his colleague was Dr. Peter Chaika. And they reported interactions with warfarin, garlic, ginger, ginkgo, and ginseng. And what was interesting is that the conclusion It said the true risk of these interactions and effects are difficult to characterize due to the limited number and nature of existing reports. Yet, every time I saw this article quoted, it was basically evidence that there were interactions that you had to be concerned about. I further took a look at another article that subsequently was published again in the Journal of American College of Cardiology in 2010. And interesting, it's kind of a circular reference. They went back and looked at garlic, ginger, ginkgo, ginseng, listed purported uses, and then again highlighted cardiac adverse effects and interactions. And again, it's presenting this data as if there's no question that these products or these particular ingredients are associated with those particular effects. What I found interesting also is that if you look at an article that was published shortly before that by Dr. Lee and his colleagues, they actually took a look at in vivo investigation. They studied 25 patients that were newly diagnosed with ischemic stroke, and they had these patients that were given standard therapy with warfarin, and other patients were given standard therapy with warfarin and Panax ginseng. And what they found was that the study suggested that co-administration of Panax ginseng and warfarin in ischemic stroke patients does not influence the pharmacologic actions of warfarin. So at best, I think that there's still a fair amount of controversy about that, and exactly which products, which ingredients, under what circumstances do they actually produce the effect. I think that there's still a fair amount of information that we need to study further to get a better handle on that. Another thing that was interesting, in that same article, Table 4, it had herbal products that may interfere with digoxin levels in assays. And I looked at the first one, it says Chan-Su, and that just was not a product that I was familiar with or an ingredient, and I started doing a little investigation, and lo and behold, you find out that Chan-Su is actually the dried venom from a Chinese toad. Now, I don't think that's an herbal product, but again, I think what we see sometimes is information creeps into these articles, especially with folks that may not be that familiar with natural medicinals or other dietary supplements or certainly botanicals, and people take it essentially at face value, especially when you're looking at an abstract. In that same article, there was use of herbal products with potential interactions in patients with cardiovascular disease. They talked about ginseng should not be used by women who are pregnant or receiving hormone replacement therapy. Neonatal death has been related to maternal use. Well, I went back again to the original article with Dr. Owang and his group, which I know Dr. Owang. And lo and behold, when you take a look at the original article that went back to the 1990s, they identified a 30-year-old nurse that had contacted the Mother Risk program in Toronto to inquire whether self-medication with pure Siberian ginseng twice daily was safe while breastfeeding her 2-week-old neonate. And it turned out that the child was born quite hirsute, and there was a question about whether or not that contributed to it. That was a single case. The child did not die, yet that information was conveyed in the previous article. So again, you have to be very careful and take a look at some of the primary literature that is presented as supporting some of the reports that you see. At the same time, you also see what happens when the media gets a hold of this information. And CNN, shortly after that article came out, talked about herbal remedies, heart drugs, a dangerous combo. And they talk about things like saw palmetto and echinacea and the like. And in fact, when an individual, a cardiologist, was actually quoted in that particular article, and I found it interesting. The cardiologist said, stay away from the 4 Gs, garlic, ginkgo, ginseng, and ginger, says Dr. So-and-so, a cardiologist at Columbia University in New York, who studied herbal remedies and heart drugs but did not participate in the current report. Her quote was, they all have effects on bleeding. She went on further to say that for her part, Dr. So-and-so recommends that heart patients and anyone else, for that matter, steer clear of all herbal products. Frankly, I would just avoid them all. She says, go into your medicine cabinet, get rid of anything you bought in an herbal store that you take in a pill form, save your money, and go buy a pair of shoes. Just doesn't seem that that's an objective way to take a look at the science associated with dietary supplements. If we take a look also a little bit further here, wait for the slide to advance here. You're having a little trouble with it moving forward. I'll try this down here and see if that helps. There we go. This was a study that was actually published before the previous study in the American Journal of Medicine, and it was actually from the Mayo Clinic. And the purpose of the study was to objectively study whether the frequency of clinically significant interactions caused by concurrent use of dietary supplements. And what they did was they surveyed 1,818 patients of theirs, 1,795 responded, so they had a 98% response. And what they found was that there were essentially 107 interactions with potential clinical significance that they identified, yet when they actually looked at the individual patients and their records, they found that no patient was harmed seriously from any interaction, and a small number of prescription medications and dietary supplements accounted for most of the interactions. The actual potential for harm was quite low. So that essentially is a little bit of a stark contrast to some of the information that was subsequently published. We also take a look at, there was an article that was published just in the last few months, and it was called The Review of Assessment and Assessment of Medicinal Safety Data of Orally Used Echinacea Preparations. And I thought this is probably one of the best articles that I've seen in recent time, which is extensively reviewing this particular substance. And what I found interesting is the fact that three particular areas, especially in light of some of the information that came out a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal, they found that in pharmacokinetic herb-drug interaction studies performed in vivo, no significant inhibitions of human CYP2D6 and CYP3A4 isoforms have been found after administration of standardized Echinacea purpura preparations. They went on to say another area, which I think a lot of us oftentimes refer to about long-term use and safety of using Echinacea, and they said due to published long-term studies with continuous ingestion of different Echinacea preparations for up to 6 months with no reported toxicological concerns, and their view was Echinacea can be recommended for long-term use. And oftentimes we're concerned, or you've seen recommendations about the question of tachyphylaxis and other types of events, yet the data supporting those cautions really doesn't seem to be there. The last thing that they did say that altogether the different evaluated Echinacea preparations are well-tolerated herbal medicines in the management of children and adults alike. To take a look at maybe doing a little bit of transition, just taking a look at how dietary supplements are portrayed in mainstream medicine and even in regulatory environments. This is the FDA's current website. I pulled this particular area talking about drug-induced liver toxicity. And I found it interesting is that they mention in the middle of this section where, I mean, it is a serious issue, but they say, as our aging world population uses more and more drugs, as well as self-prescribed over-the-counter medications, so-called dietary supplements. Now, this is the FDA's website. As of last time I checked, dietary supplements have actually been codified by Congress and by the FDA. They're a specific class of product as regulated by the FDA. It seems like we're sending mixed messages to patients and practitioners when they see this kind of information even published in at a regulatory website such as the FDA. The other thing I've noticed is as you look at even the area of supplement-induced liver injury, which I think is seriously an area that we need to pay attention to. But when this first was coming out, the Journal of Hepatology had an article a few years ago, and they talked about slimming at all cost, Herbalife-induced liver injury. What surprised me is how that actually got through peer review, to have a title of that nature. If you actually take a look at this particular product or this title, how would practitioners and the reviewers looked at the title if it would have said slimming at all cost, Eli Lilly-induced drug or liver injury? You know, the point that I'm trying to make is that how does a drug company or even a supplement company cause liver injury, especially when they've got hundreds of different dissimilar products with different indications, different ingredients? I think it does indicate that oftentimes we do see bias that shows up in the even in our science journals. Now, getting to that topic of liver injury caused by herbals, a friend and colleague, Dr. Vic Navarro at Einstein Medical Center, who runs the Drug-Induced Liver Injury Network, has actually published on this particular topic, and he presented information in 2014, and he said new research shows that liver injury caused by herbals and dietary supplements increased from 7% to 20% in a U.S. study over a 10-year period. It's interesting how that information was actually portrayed, and when you actually look at the data that he was presenting, he identified that there were the top 10 therapeutic classes and individual agents that cause drug-induced liver injury in the U.S. They had 900 patients during that 10-year period. And if you look at the list of products that they have there very closely, what I thought was interesting is that they grouped herbal and dietary supplements together, and in the entire class of product, you had 145 cases over a 10-year period that were suspected to be associated with some nature of a herbal or a dietary supplement. That works out to be about 14 cases a year on an average. When you consider the trillions of servings of dietary supplements on an annual basis, it's kind of hard to think that that's necessarily an epidemic. Not to minimize the fact that there may certainly be products that are associated with liver complications, and we need to study that. But I think we need to also keep some context in terms of what the potential risk might be. The other thing that I thought was interesting, and he's presented this data at the University of Mississippi's National Center for Natural Product Research in our annual conference that we have each year in April, and he's going to be presenting again this year. But he identified that catechins, in his view, may potentially be contributing. And what I found interesting about this particular slide as we went through the data, it was published in the Digestive Diseases and Science journal. They identified that for the cases that involved potential catechins, they believe that they didn't see really a dose-dependent type of interaction. So it may actually be either an idiosyncratic type of reaction, or maybe it's the type of patients that ultimately use these particular products. But the thing that was most interesting to me was when you actually look at the findings, he reported that approximately 40% of the products implicated in liver injury had unlabeled catechin. Now, essentially, if you have a product that's got catechins or other ingredients that are unlabeled, essentially that's an adulterated product or misbranded product, and it's subject to FDA intervention, which can include market withdrawal, recall, and other criminal types of actions. So I think that was a concern, that they identified that there were a number of products that were not properly labeled with the information. And that is something that I think that we need to pay close attention to make sure that that's not an issue with products that our patients are taking. But going back to how this information was then presented on a national level, Medical Daily then published their follow-up to this particular article, and they say dietary herbal supplements lead to liver damage 20% of the time. Now that's an epidemic. If that's actually what was happening, that 20% of people taking dietary supplements develop liver injury, of course that's going to be an issue. But you can see how that information was essentially taken out of context. In the same light, I think that some of that information has spilled over as we've seen other types of reports that have come out. One that many of you are probably familiar with is the article that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine a few months back, and it looked at emergency department visits for adverse events related to dietary supplements. I looked at that article pretty closely because I think there's some interesting pieces of information to take away from it. First of all, what they had done was they used NEIS data, the National Electronic Injury Surveillance Data System, which I'll talk about a little bit later here. But they used that information, which has it for data from 63 emergency departments around the United States, so that they can have a statistical sample to draw from to determine what might be happening on a national level. And they had, on the basis of 3,667 cases, they estimated that there's about 23,000 emergency department visits per year that are attributed to adverse events related to dietary supplements. Now, it's interesting, they're assuming, and at least if you look at the results, it assumes that everybody that showed up in an emergency room had an adverse event. So let's take a closer look at some of that data to see, take a closer look at it. And also the way that it was reported in the press. So as soon as the article comes out, the next day it says this study is the first to document the extent of severe injuries and hospitalizations tied to dietary supplements. So again, let's take a close look at the data and make sure that that's exactly what's happening. And also, as we start to look at that data, let's keep in perspective some background data on dietary supplements. We have about 166 million people in the United States use dietary supplements annually. And many of those people use one or more on a daily basis with multiple doses. So you're talking about literally trillions of servings on an annual basis. So you have to keep a denominator in perspective. If you look at other important statistics, number of ER visits for all causes, you have about 136 million. ER visits associated with prescription drugs taken as prescribed, 731,000, and that's from the CDC in 2015. Even pediatric ER visits associated with 30 million children participating in organized sports, 775,000 events. And then CDC estimates that each year roughly 48 million people get sick from foodborne illness, which I think is an important area, because if you think of dietary supplements, they're essentially a cross between food as well as food-like substances that have a therapeutic benefit. But in this particular case, they found 128,000 are hospitalized, 3,000 die, and then allergic anaphylaxis reactions to food. They had 30,000 ER visits, 2,000 hospitalizations, and 150 deaths. So think about that in the backdrop as we then take a closer look at some of the data in the article. First of all, you see in this column here, you have the number of cases, 3,667, extrapolated to be 23,000 in the national venue. And look at the age groups. Something that stuck out to me, we had 21% of the cases were children less than 4 years of age. So actually, when you start to take a closer look at that and you look at the reasons, specifically look at the mechanism of the adverse event. You have adverse reaction, which I think are seriously things that we need to look at closely, because an adverse reaction means that typically that somebody has used the product as directed, as formulated, and ended up with some type of an adverse complication as to somebody excessive doses or overdoses or things like that. You had 7,000 cases, so that's out of the 23,000, that was 7,663. Allergic reaction, another 5,434, and then the unsupervised ingestion by children, 21%, that was 4,871. And there's some interesting information in there. Having been a director of a regional, one of the largest regional poison centers, I'm pretty familiar with that data and what percentage of patients that actually ingest dietary supplements, especially children, actually result in any adverse consequences as a result of those exposures, and I'll mention that in a second here. But let's talk about the NICE database first. Remember, it's data from 63 participating hospitals as a representative sample from U.S. emergency rooms. It was first established by the Consumer Product Safety Commission to monitor consumer product-related injuries that send people to the emergency rooms. And I think it was a very, very good database for that. We needed to get a better handle on what kinds of injuries were occurring with consumer products. And they were looking at things like lawnmowers, toasters, cribs, car seats, high chairs, and the like. If you think about it, when somebody shows up in the emergency room with a lawnmower injury, it's not because they were looking at the lawnmower and wondered if it was going to hurt them. You usually start thinking about amputations, you think about digits being severed, cuts, things of that nature. So this would be a pretty good database to determine the extent of potential injuries. That's why people would show up. It was expanded in 2002 to the cooperative adverse drug event surveillance. So it included anyone showing up in an emergency room that a dietary supplement was listed as a potential involved substance. And it was designed to be a surrogate measure of presumed serious injuries associated with consumer products. So if we take a look at some of the notable observations and what I think are limitations that may make it a little bit more difficult to interpret what it really means. First of all, outcome severity is not delineated. And as many of you know, if you work in an emergency department or in a practice that you have that opportunity, not all ER visits are created equal. We have a lot of people that come in that have suspected events or that you may result in some type of an event. And so just determining what level of severity is associated with what it is that they're reporting with is going to be an important feature. The second thing is that there's really no treatment information provided. In this particular list of emergency room visits, the authors noted that most patients with palpitations, chest pain, or tachycardia associated with supplement-related adverse events were discharged. It was 90% of those patients with those types of events. It would have been helpful for us to know what kind of treatment was rendered. Were these people that had spontaneous resolution of symptoms after an observation period in the emergency room, like you might have with maybe a product that's got a stimulant or caffeine in it? Or did they actually need pharmacologic intervention to actually to treat the condition? That would have been, I think, a meaningful piece of information to identify which people really had serious injuries associated with that. If only 10% were actually admitted, that really reduces the number considerably. The other thing that I noticed was that the age and reason for admission was not delineated. So we had ICU versus observation ward as equivalent, essentially. So hospitalizations could include actually a hospital admission. It could be an observation status admission or a transfer to another acute care facility. So knowing which group of patients were being admitted, especially if there were a lot of pediatric cases. I'd certainly like to know that. But it does make it difficult to interpret. Another thing is that not all allergy events are associated with supplements. Suspected products or ingredients are created equal. As cited in the article, approximately 10% of the allergic reactions were listed as severe, and the balance were minor, moderate in nature. And I think most of us realize that when you're seeing a patient in the emergency room, you go through your standard exclusion criteria. But most often, if you really have somebody that you think has got an allergy, that confirmatory diagnosis typically for minor or even severe allergic reactions typically is done in follow-up exams with primary care providers, not necessarily in the emergency room. There certainly may be if you're looking at standard factors of association, if the person has got a temporal relationship and the like, it may be a stronger relationship, but at least in terms of confirming the relationship, again, I think oftentimes that's done with the primary care providers after the ER visit. If we look at the pediatric exposures I mentioned earlier, child-resistant closures aren't provided on many of these products simply because they're classified as GRAS or generally recognized as safe, and the CRCs typically aren't warranted. So what ends up happening is that ingestions of dietary supplements may be overrepresented just due to lack of familiarity with ingredients that could cause patients, caregivers, even pediatricians to err on the side of caution and have a child seen in an ER after any unintended exposure. So we have cases where a child, gets a hold of a couple of echinacea tablets or some other natural product. And again, if a clinician is not familiar with that particular product or ingredient, erring on the side of caution is not unusual. But what ends up happening is they go in the emergency room, you watch them for a few hours, and they get discharged, not admitted, and there's really no adverse effects that are actually seen. It's just that we observe the patient, and in order to get paid, oftentimes the hospitals you're going to have those cases coded as poisoning because that's what your IDC-9 codes are going to allow you to get paid for in evaluating the case. So sometimes that information can be taken out of context. Another one that I think is interesting is that not all iron-containing exposure are created equal. We've seen a substantial decrease in the number of serious poisoning cases involving iron preparation, certainly with judicious use and continuous use of child-resistant closures. But even the form of iron has changed in many of the products that are in the market. If you look at carbonyl iron, it's got an incredibly wide margin of safety and difficult to see serious toxicity associated with ingestions even in children. So again, you need to take a look at the particular products that were involved to get an understanding of that. There's also other confounding variables in assessing the role of dietary supplements in the adverse reaction category. Many adverse reaction-related diagnoses are diagnosis of exclusion. And if you've got somebody that is having some type of a life event, something's happening, the most recent thing they can remember doing was taking the dietary supplement that they take on a daily basis and have been doing so for years, oftentimes that can be thrown in and given the benefit of the doubt as a potential contributing cause. So you have to rule out emergence of new disease, exacerbation or reemergence of pre-existing disease. You also have to think outside the box, and I'm going to mention some of that as we get further in the presentation, but we certainly have to look at the possibility that maybe there's a product integrity question that comes up for a particular product where there might be a specification breach or some other activity or issue that's affecting the quality of that particular product, and or just alternative diagnosis not necessarily being considered as associated with that particular event. The other thing I noticed in this article too, they did list in the appendix substances that of product inclusion, and they said additional products that are often used by consumers for complementary health but do not fall under the regulatory definition of dietary supplements. They listed topically administered herbal or homeopathic products were also included in the analysis. Well, I went through that list. I see things like dimethyl sulfoxide and calcium polycarbophil, and even literally the quote snake oil. I don't think those really fall into the category of a codified dietary supplement. So we have to make sure that we're talking apples and apples and not apples and oranges when we look at some of this information. Another thing that I noticed as we went through the data is that there really is no perspective on numerator and denominator. And I think there's a lot of times we suffer from not having that kind of information. In many circumstances, we have that data for prescription drugs because we know how many patients we can get access to how many servings of various types of dosage forms of various medications are being taken, and you can put adverse events in context in terms of how many patients are exposed. But in these particular cases, especially for the supplements, the question is, what's the numerator for severe outcome cases as compared to the total visits and the corresponding overall incident rates? So I think that's another thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Excuse me, understanding the numerator and denominator is really important. And so that leads us one final question, and I think the authors did a good job of highlighting this. What is the incidence of adverse events associated with dietary supplements properly manufactured and meeting all requirements of DSHEA? And in fact, if you look at their quote, they said the safety of dietary supplements that are not known to be adulterated remains poorly described. However, data are lacking to quantify the frequency of adverse events associated with dietary supplements in the United States. So, again, that does identify a significant limitation in trying to put some of that information in context. So I think that it did highlight some legitimate issues that I think we as practitioners need to keep in the back of our minds and certainly share with our patients. First of all, exactly which products are involved in suspected events. It would be really helpful to know which of those products or which products were more predominant in their particular analysis. If they had access to that data, it would have been nice to see specific products. So if we were finding that there's a specific product that is disproportionately represented, at least we could, develop a hypothesis and investigate into that product or its ingredients. Also have the issue of unconventional or prohibited new ingredients that are appearing in the marketplace. A lot of times people will come in with a product that actually is an adulterated product. They could have things like BMPEA or DMAA in the product, which have been essentially banned by the FDA, and the practitioners may or may not be familiar with what's happening on that front and not realize that it's actually a banned product and masquerading as a dietary supplement. You could have, and that brings up the other issue, and that's testing of products for adulteration to identify those events that involve products that are masquerading as appropriately designed and labeled and formulated dietary supplements. I think that we need to have a much more focused approach on taking suspected products, having them analyzed, especially when they're involved in high integrity cases of suspected serious adverse events, and have those types of products tested. The University of Mississippi has got an extensive program in that area and is actually now starting to work with the Drug-Induced Liver Injury Network to identify products that are involved with some of the patients that they're seeing. So I hope that we get a little bit more data on that front. The other thing is the difficulty swallowing issue, and I think this is something that all of us can relate to, especially as we have patients that get older. They have different types of medical conditions, Sjogren's disease, things like that, saliva and being able to swallow issues are really a problem. And oftentimes what I've seen with patients, and maybe you've seen it as well, is that they take a handful of products all at the same time. They mix their drugs, their supplements, and everything. They put them in their mouth so that they swallow them all at once, which is really a recipe for disaster. So just pointing out how many times this occurs, we can caution our patients to be really careful about the way that they take those particular products, especially ones that are larger tablets, calcium-containing tablets, which are a real popular dietary supplement. The other thing that I wanted to do was spend just a couple minutes talking about the clinician role in post-market surveillance. Certainly that's a topic near and dear to my heart, but if you think about the role of post-market surveillance, especially for dietary supplements in this class of product, it's really the last safety net before that patient takes that product as far as monitoring for the safety of those particular products, especially in the absence of other ongoing clinical trials. So I oftentimes think it's important to point out what really the best practice companies do and how they collaborate with practitioners like yourself to address the intent of the mandatory serious adverse event reporting laws, but also to monitor the safety of their products. If we think about post-market surveillance, it's really a performance-based process where you do incident investigation, you categorize information so that you can basically look at signal detection. And with signal detection, you identify potential points where you need to potentially take a closer look. It also depends on passive but sensitive surveillance, a passive but sensitive surveillance system. And what I mean by that is that you need a lot of information coming in so that you can sort through it. And I really encourage practitioners, if you have a patient that you suspect has had some type of an adverse consequence as a result of using the supplement, by all means, either you report it to the manufacturer or have the patient do so. And I think that comes into the last thing. Clinicians play a vital role in monitoring, identifying, and reporting suspected adverse events involving supplements. I oftentimes get the question, should they report it to the manufacturer, the FDA, or both? If it's a serious adverse event, by all means, I'd consider reporting to both the manufacturer and the FDA. But remember, if you report a serious adverse event to the manufacturer, they have a legal obligation, a regulatory obligation to document those events, evaluate them for their level of seriousness, and report those to the FDA. So that if you report a serious adverse event and give all the information to the manufacturer, they are duty bound and have a regulatory requirement to report that to the FDA. They don't have a requirement to report minor or non-serious adverse events, but they have a requirement to document all of those events, and they have to be available for inspection during an FDA compliance audit. And that's one of the first things that compliance officers typically do, is take a look at the adverse event data files to make sure that the company is following and monitoring the safety of their products. So I oftentimes really make an emphasis, report it to the manufacturer. They're the ones that can take the quickest action to make decisions on what needs to be done. And so in terms of how we use that data from a post-market surveillance, it's oftentimes really important to normalize the incident rates. If you've got trillions of servings or hundreds of thousands of servings and you have 3 events, that's a whole lot different than you just launched a new product, you've got 500 bottles out there and you have 3 to 5 events. That's kind of a bigger deal. Identifying acceptable ranges and actionable variations. It's really important to make sure that you identify the safety profile of that particular product. You determine expected events based on the toxicology and the product design. Oftentimes we're in a good position to take a look at what we might expect with certain types of products, just based on what we know about the pharmacology and even the patients that use them. And then we identify predictable events and their expected incident rates as that product essentially moves its way through its life cycle. The other thing that's really going to be important is incident integrity scoring. And what I mean by this is that you have to consider that most consumer healthcare product events are spontaneously reported as opposed to being clinical trial generated. So that means that you have to take a look at the standard factors of association for that particular event to determine higher quality events versus lower quality events. Somebody calling up and saying that their uncle's cousin used a product and their arm fell off is not very useful in terms of determining whether or not there's really a significant issue with a product. So you have to be able to differentiate those high quality types of events, and oftentimes those high quality events come from practitioners like yourself. And that helps a manufacturer and others, even the FDA, identify background noise or events that simultaneously are occurring but they're unrelated to product use. And I think that this class of product in general has quite a bit of that happens, simply because many of the products are lifestyle products. People are on them for extended periods of time, and as they age and we have older populations that are using them, other life events happen, or other medical conditions essentially emerge. And as a consequence of that, if they have a new event that happens, they just realize that they took their multivitamin this morning, they may suspect that there's some type of a relationship. So you have to realize that there is going to be background noise in this particular data set. The other thing, too, is that when you have that, like I mentioned, you identify trends in low-scoring, unexpected events, and consider potential relationships to product issues. And this is where I think practitioners play a vital role. And that's in evaluating sentinel events to determine if there's something associated either with that product as formulated, or if there's something going on with that product that could potentially compromise the product. So for suspected sentinel events or for deviations in expected incident rates, do individual incidents represent, and I always tell clinicians to think about this, somebody comes in and they report that they took the product and they had this event. We look up in the national standards or in the natural medicine comprehensive database and say, nope, we don't see that listed, so it must not be related. Think outside the box as to other things that could have potentially contributed to that particular event and potentially have a relationship. That could be a quality control issue or even contamination. Something can happen even before it leaves the plant in the manufacturing process. Or we've also seen situations where product has been intentionally adulterated once it gets into the marketplace. So we have to be on the lookout for that. You can also have direct but predictable or previously recognized adverse effects based on the inherent toxicology and pharmacology of the product or the ingredient. And as you know, that can be either a dose-dependent or a dose-independent effect or an idiosyncratic reaction. So you need to think about that. You also can have, and this is an important one, direct but previously unrecognized adverse effects of the product or an ingredient, which could be, again, idiosyncratic, or it could even be secondary to long-term effects where there haven't been long-term studies for a particular formulation or an ingredient. And it maybe has just not been recognized because there hasn't been a large enough population consuming the product to identify events that occur rarely, but actually do occur, once you get to that particular threshold. So we have to keep that in mind too. The other thing is that for the suspected sentinel events or deviations in the expected incident rates, you're always going to ask yourself the question, is it an interaction-related event? And it could be with another drug, it could be with disease, it could be with food, it could be environment. A lot of information that we're seeing right now is the biologic or gene expression. Maybe there's something in that particular patient population and the way that the biologic gene expression is influencing how that person is responding to the product. You could have other consumer products concomitantly being used, and once it's in the hands of the consumers, as you all know, there's just countless numbers of options of things that could be going on. You can also have old botanical or new botanicals use. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the long-term history of the use of various types of botanicals, the way that their traditional use has been over the centuries in other cultures, they may have been using very, very low doses of a particular botanical and using it very effectively without any complications. Probably the best example is that is ephedra. If you look at ephedra being used in traditional Chinese medicine in extremely low doses, it appeared to have a fairly wide margin of safety. It wasn't until it was actually used in a dietary supplement context where concentrated amounts, high-level amounts, and people having access to very large amounts of it actually demonstrated that it had unreasonable risk associated with its use. So you have to think about that in terms of the context of the product that's being used. The last one here I have listed is counterfeit product, and this is kind of interesting. As you start to see products that have got a high price tag on them, especially with high quality control products that are more pricey, it also invites the possibility of economic counterfeiting. And I have a colleague of mine that at the University of Texas, Dr. Marv Shepard, has looked at this for years. This is an example, just to give you some backdrop. Ponstan is an anti-inflammatory product. This counterfeit was found in Colombia. If you look on the left-hand side, the first is yellow powder. It consists of boric acid, floor wax, yellow highway paint, and it was pressed into tablets and placed in foil packs with labeling that you could not discern the difference between that and the original appropriately labeled product. If you look at it a little bit closer, if you take a close look at your screen right now, take a look at these two different products and know that one of them is counterfeit and one of them is the real product. So if you take a look at that, see how many of you got it right. The product actually on the left is the one that's fake and the one on the right is the authentic, and I wouldn't have picked that. When I first saw the slide, I would have picked the one on the left to be the actual original from Pfizer. So then we take a look at are reported effects in any given category preventable, and then can reported effects in any given category be prevented, managed, and or mitigated through disclosure, education, reformulation, maybe a new manufacturing process with changes in solvents and the like, maybe a new product design or a multi-ingredient review, dosage adjustment, or even advising patients on how to use the product. And in the worst case scenario, certainly market withdrawal or recall may be warranted depending on what issue has been identified. So as we kind of come to the end here, DSHEA and dietary supplement safety, I get a lot of comments from my colleagues both in pharmacy and medicine about the fact that dietary supplements are not regulated when in fact they are regulated. I think it's important to identify what the key features of DSHEA are that actually are very well designed. If you take a look at DSHEA, it defines substances that are eligible for inclusion in a dietary supplement. It has specific provisions for FDA to evaluate and approve new dietary ingredients before they're allowed to be included in dietary supplements. You also have specific GMP requirements that have gone into place in recent years, which is why more and more companies are being audited and inspected by the FDA to ensure that they are meeting their full GMP requirements for quality. We also have, as amended, specific requirements for mandatory documenting and reporting of both serious and non-serious adverse events. That went into effect in 2007. And I can tell you that the best practice companies take any allegation of a serious adverse event very seriously, and they want to make sure that they understand what's happening so that they can ensure that their patients are getting the intended benefit without unintended consequence. So again, that's a very important feature of product safety. It also grants the FDA specific authorities for declaring products adulterated and or misbranded, including recall and detention action. So if you have a product that's in the marketplace and you have unlabeled catechins, for example, that product can be essentially declared adulterated and it can be removed from the market by the FDA. They have that authority. We also have specific requirements for labeling and claims. I know that that's sometimes a challenge, but in interpreting some of that information, but there are guidelines and responsibilities that the manufacturer has to follow for not only labeling appropriately, but having substantiation for the claims that are being made for that product. And then last, it does contain provisions for both civil and criminal penalties for violations. I think that's an important feature to realize that companies can and are held accountable if they are intentionally either adulterating or putting in medicines or prescription items into dietary supplements. There are a variety of civil and criminal penalties that can be levied. So last thing I want to do is just take a look and look at clinician context for safety and DSHEA, the top 3 focus areas that I think warrant really a significant amount of attention. And the first one is FDA funding limitations leading to lack of enforcement. I think the fact that FDA has been elevated the Division of Dietary Supplements to a center is going to have a huge impact on availability of resources and additional compliance efforts on that front. But right now, I think that we have a legitimate concern that the limited FDA funding is allowing some rogue companies with products masquerading as supplements to remain in the marketplace, and I think that's a concern for all of us. The other thing is appropriate scientific investigations into botanical ingredient safety circumvented by innuendo. And I was explaining in some of the earlier comments that I made about interactions and so forth. I think that's really a disservice to our patients and certainly clinicians to make comments that you can't back up or there's not really good supporting data. So I think we have to be really careful to use evidence-based medicine and make sure that the supporting data actually supports whatever precaution that we're listing and not let it be run by innuendo. And then lastly, clinician context to guide individual patients. And I can't tell you how important this is, I think, for our patients. A vital component of rational risk-benefit assessment is sitting down with the patients, helping them identify what is their goal, why are they taking a particular supplement, what is their expected benefit, and then working with you as a clinician to help them identify what is it they're going to achieve, how are they going to achieve it, and how do they monitor either for success or failure, and also how do they continue to monitor for safety. And again, the best adverse event information that we get usually come from clinicians like yourself, so I think that's really important. Last thing I've got listed there is referral to rational information regarding supplement selection. And this is a plug for the Council of Responsible Nutrition. If you go to their website in this particular location, they have a fact sheet, a dozen consumer tips to help consumers identify products and companies that they believe are best practice companies with quality products. It's really excellent. I use it on a regular basis, even with family members, to help them identify why would you want to be taking this product, what do you need to look at in terms of a company to determine whether or not they're potentially a good mix. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that. The only last thing I might mention is that sometimes we do see information that comes across, like the article that came out in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, talking about which patients do have to take extra precautions. By all means, if you have a patient that's a brittle diabetic, or they have a brittle condition that's being managed by various pharmaceuticals, and or they're just recently put on anticoagulants, of course those are populations that you want to take more caution. You don't want to add any new ingredients, whether it's unnecessary over-the-counter drugs, dietary supplements, or even unnecessary medications. So I think that we do need to pay attention to those patients that may not be best served thinking that there's a quick fix for their newly diagnosed ischemic stroke that they experience. So you have to help them, navigate those waters. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and in my remarks at this point, I really appreciate people staying on the line and listening, and I'm certainly open to entertain some questions that folks might have. I think we've got a few minutes left before the end here.
Thank you, Dr. Kingston. So yes, you may, if you have any questions at this time, feel free to enter them on your GoToWebinar control panel. I do have a question for you, Dr. Kingston. Noting the contradictory reports of herb-drug interactions in peer-reviewed literature and news articles, how can pharmacists or practitioners find reliable sources of information on the topic?
I think the best advice that I can give is that if you have a patient and you suspect that there might be a potential concern, if you're taking a look at the literature, look at the primary supporting data. If they're simply referencing a previous article and saying that you have to beware, that's not good enough. You need to go back and take a look at the original research, the original study, identify which product was actually being used, and is that the product that your patient is asking about, or is it the formulation? It's going to be important for you to look at that information for yourself and think for yourself as whether or not you believe that it pertains to your particular patient. There are a lot of good studies that have been done. I think that there's still a fair amount of controversy out there on a number of the things. And remember, a lot of the interactions that you see reported, even in some of the the main databases, whether it's a natural medicine database or what have you, they're relative contraindications. They're not absolute contraindications. So you know your patient better than the databases. And so you're in a better position to go take a look at the primary literature, do your own investigation, take a look at the supporting data and see if it applies to your particular patient. The other thing I would suggest is that there are a number of conferences that occur each year that help you understand many of the different products, ingredients, and so forth. Probably one of the best conferences that I would recommend if you're interested in this area is the conference at the National Center for Natural Product Research at the University of Mississippi. That conference is held each year in April. This year it's going to be in conjunction with the Society of Pharmacognosy. It's an extremely beneficial conference. The folks at the University of Mississippi, they run the National Center for Natural Product Research, which is co-funded by the FDA. There's a high presence of FDA health effects officers, regulators, and other international experts in the science of botanicals. And so you can learn just an incredible amount about the science of botanicals. And we routinely discuss safety issues. In fact, this year there's a special section that I'm going to be chairing that deals with drug-induced liver injury and supplement-induced injury with Dr. Navarro and his team and some other folks. So if you have a chance to attend, I think that would be a great opportunity for folks. Just want to put in a plug for my colleagues there.
That's great. Thank you. I think our final question here is, what considerations should be made when deciding to report an adverse event as serious to FDA's supporting safety reporting protocol?
I think this is an important, very important item, and I touched on it as I went through the presentation. If you have a patient and you suspect that there's some relationship between a supplement and an adverse effect or an adverse condition that patient has, by all means, even if you only suspect it, report it to the manufacturer, and you're certainly can report it to the FDA as well. I think it's so vital that we have a sensitive surveillance system, and to have a lot of I wonder if types of cases is important, because you can take a look at the quality of those particular events, and oftentimes we find after we start looking at the data much more closely, you get one case here and one case there, and you kind of think that it's background noise. But when you start getting 10 to 15 cases with very uncharacteristic symptoms or conditions, but they have a common thread in them, all of a sudden it's no longer background noise. You've got an emerging issue, and the only way that you pick those up is that you have to have clinicians out there being astute and thinking outside the box as to whether or not, under this particular circumstance, I wonder if there might be some type of relationship. So I strongly recommend that you identify those events, and even if you yourself don't report them if you, for whatever reason, don't have the opportunity to do so. Encourage your patients to do it. These companies have a mandatory requirement to document them, and they want to hear from their patients if there's a question about whether or not the product is involved with some type of effect that they're experiencing. So again, monitor, be part of that surveillance process, and certainly report anything that you see as potentially suspicious.
That's great. Thank you so much. I believe that concludes our session on making sense of dietary supplement adverse event data. I'd love to thank Dr. Kingston for his time today to speak on this topic, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.